Digital 410 Productions proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Dodd Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Henry Sledge.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II based podcast. And we are back for another Monday. I'm back for my first reenactment since last January. We will cover that in next week's episode because, well, we have far more important things to talk about with our guest tonight. But before we get to our guest tonight, as always, joining us from Texas, Jeff Copsetta. Jeff, how you doing tonight, sir?
Oh, man, I'm just rolling.
Rolling and ready to go. And the one and the only Mr. Henry Sledge. Henry, how are you doing tonight, friend?
Oh, doing fine, man. Glad to be here as always.
I think I'm going to let you take the pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. And we'll
Absolutely.
Get this ball
so
rolling.
tonight we're really happy to have my good personal friend Adam Makos join us. Adam and I have known each other since Adam, 2009, when we got hooked up, when you guys were ramping up for the Pacific. We did some cool things together. I have a lot of fond memories of the friendship we forged, the work we did together, and it's just great to have you in here with us.
Henry, thank God for the Pacific, because it shined light on that forgotten theater. It gave us new heroes, and hey, it brought you into the World War II community like it has. And so beyond our friendship, it's been really awesome to see you, carry on your dad's legacy. So I'm thankful to know you, and I admire what you're doing.
Well, likewise, man. So, gosh, I mean, where do we even start? Is there anything particular, you've obviously got Devotion about to hit the silver screen, working on new stuff. Jeff, you want to kick off with a question here?
Oh, certainly. It's going to be a little bit of a story leading into a question, just to give Adam some background of why I'm just such a big fan of what you've been doing. My introduction to you was from my brother. He said, man, I'm reading this book and you're going to love it. It's about B-17s. It's just this amazing story. He said, you're not going to believe it. And I'm thinking, how did my brother hear about this book before I did? Is what I was thinking. And so he was listening to it on his way to where it was an audio version of it. And but he couldn't remember the name of it when he was telling me. He had listened to it months before. I was up back in Jersey visiting him. I'm originally from New Jersey. And I said, well, when you find the title, or if you remember, let me know. It sounds really compelling. I'd love to read it. And obviously he was talking about A Higher Call. So I immediately ordered the book, and I was reading something else at the time, but I got to, it was the next book. I kind of bumped it up the list, and I'm glad I did, because that has really changed a lot for me. I've read hundreds of books, and it's a good book when you remember where you were at when you were reading it. You kind of have that connection. It could be 10 years. I mean, I remember some of the books that I was reading when I was in Baghdad, right? And as dynamic as that situation was, I still remember some of these important books, and A Higher Call was certainly one of those important books. And not just the story itself, I think, Adam, but just what you've been able to do. I think you and I are, you were from that area too, right? And I feel like we're about the, similar in age and passion. And to hear you mention these air shows and Oscar Bosch, the name Oscar Bosch comes up in your forward there. And I've mentioned on the show before, I got to spend an afternoon with that man in an air show in 1998, and how that just was, it's an unforgettable experience. And so I guess really my first question is, I kind of know a little bit of the backstory, but what is that one moment for you where you went to, or when you went from kind of that, just a big history buff as a kid, to being somebody now, who's really looked upon as somebody who, not just a good storyteller, but a good researcher, somebody who really puts so much into their work, to be the name that you've created for yourself. Is there something that happened where you can say this was a fork in the road where this is what led me to what I'm doing today?
Jeff, I think with every book there is that moment, and with A Higher Call, that was my first book I ever wrote, and I can remember exactly where I was when it took place. Just like you said, you can remember sometimes when you've read a good book where you were. For me, it was I had graduated from college, and it was like a Friday night. I was living in small town Pennsylvania, probably bored out of my mind. Um, and I'm sitting at my computer at 9 o'clock at night, and I'm kind of just the internet back in those days is the kind that would be all scratchy, and I'm reading about Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler. And I wrote this letter that night because I was a journalist working for a homemade magazine at the time. And I wrote to Charlie Brown and I said, "Dear Mr. Brown, I'm writing this magazine. I'd love to interview you." And I put it in the mail, and kind of that was my night. Well, a week or two later, I get a phone call, and it's Charlie Brown. And he said, "Adam, I looked at your magazine. I like your magazine." He said, "You've got one thing wrong about your approach. You want to talk to me. You want to come to Miami and see me. You want to talk on the phone." He said, "You're going about it all wrong." He said, "I'm just a character in this story. The hero is the German." And I can still remember that conversation. I can still remember just being a kid in my bedroom. I was probably, I don't know, 23 years old, talking to Charlie Brown, and he's challenging me to expand my World War II horizons beyond just what I knew from Memphis Belle and what I knew from 12 O'Clock High, what I knew from my grandfather and what I knew from an air show. He's saying, you've got to go into uncharted territory, and you've got to be brave, and you've got to learn about something other than what you like and what's convenient. And that was, do you want to talk to Franz Stiegler? And if you do, he wasn't doing so well health wise. He said, he's not going to come to you, and I don't think you're going to be able to talk to him over the phone. He said, you have to go there. So suddenly I'm flying from Pennsylvania to Vancouver, Canada, and I'm getting a taxi to the little community of Surrey where Franz Stiegler and his wife Haya were living. And next thing you know, I'm sitting down across from this German, and on the way I brought this book about JG-27 in the desert. I'm reading about Marseille, and I'm trying to learn what a Geschwader is and what's all this stuff. And it was a crash course. But then I sat down with Franz Stiegler, and I remember he said to me, "Thank you for coming. What is it you would like to know?" And it's like big open-ended question. I'm like, "Well, Franz, I'm here for 7 to 10 days, so we'll just we'll start with your boyhood and we'll work our way through it." But I never pat myself on the back very much. People say, "Oh, you did a great job on this book," and I always think, yeah, I did my part of the book. I wrote it. I did my job. But really, without that fork in the road, without guys like Charlie Brown, Franz Stiegler, Tom Hudner, Clarence Schmoyer, if these guys didn't open their door to me, if they weren't the gentlemen that they are, I wouldn't have even had a chance to step to the plate. So I always look at it as a team effort. It's almost 50% them, 50% me. I'm just the one sitting at the keyboard late at night.
Well, you bring up a great point, and I think all of us probably feel the same way, that have the passion that we have and the respect and the honor for that generation. I felt it's similar in your position a lot of times, where people thank me for what I'm doing, and it's like, what are you talking about? It's about them. This is not it's not about us. It's about them. And but it also takes somebody like yourself. Not anybody can do what you do. And it definitely takes somebody like you to, who's Charlie Brown? Without me and probably a lot of people that read that book would have never heard the story. What good is it at that point if 100 years from now it's forgotten, and now you have immortalized it in a way, and kept it going. And I really respect that, because like I said, just growing up as a Memphis Belle, 12 O'Clock High, you mentioned that, like, that's just me all over. And having the opportunity to reenact, and of course now I direct a museum that's not as fun as it sounds. A lot of times it's a difficult position, and being a high school teacher now as well is allowing me those opportunities to also make sure that we are reaching the next generation, reaching our youth, making sure that this stuff does stay relevant. And again, the way you have told that story, I've read so many books about the subject, but it was fresh, it was new, and it was compelling. And so I think you deserve a huge pat on the back. Yes, without them, we wouldn't have the story, and without you, we wouldn't have heard it. So well done.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. And relevance is the last thing I'll just say to add on to Jeff's comment is I remember when World War II wasn't relevant, and I was a kid in middle school at the time, 14 years old, 15, and I read these books about the Flying Tigers, and I would try to tell my friends, hey, have you seen a P-51 Mustang, and did you see Empire of the Sun where the Mustang came over and he says Cadillac of the Sky, and all this stuff that spoke to me. Even if we're talking Where Eagles Dare or Kelly's Heroes, even the silly stuff, nobody was there to talk to me about it. Nobody cared. In the late 80s, 90s, early 90s, World War II didn't exist. Even when the Gulf War rolled around, World War II was a past memory. And so I was living through those years where it was frustrating and you felt like the past had been completely forgotten and it was never coming back. No kid in America would ever know what a Tiger tank was. And, that was a tough time because relevance, it wasn't relevant. And there's something inside of all of us that love this stuff, that the lack of relevance is irritating. It burns you up. It's the opposite of how things should be. And so when Saving Private Ryan comes out and The Greatest Generation, World War II gets a revival, suddenly it was really cool because I was sitting in a place where I had loved this for so long. I had studied it for so long. I had kind of cut my teeth writing these stories for nobody. And now suddenly there's people who are going to listen. And so I feel like the last 20 years, last 25, last 30 years have been an absolute gift. And it's more than we could ask for. So now we just have to do our part to kind of stoke that fire and keep it going. But hey, thank God it happened.
And to your point, around that time, the movies that Hollywood were making were all Vietnam based. You had Hamburger Hill, you had Platoon, you had Full Metal Jacket. So even in the 70s and 80s, if there were any interest towards military stuff, because of what Hollywood was putting out, it was all Vietnam based. And then you, rolling into the early 90s, you had if there's anything remotely aimed towards kids, you're looking at Iron Eagle, and well, we won't go down that route. So yes, it wasn't until, Save It Private Ryan came out that, the spotlight finally got redirected onto this particular era and war. And I think a lot of us feel the same way because, being a living historian and a reenactor, I never understood why a lot of reenactors, they kind of frown a little bit on the Band of Brothers because they're like, well, after Band of Brothers came out, everybody came out here and, 101st Airborne outfits. It's like, yeah, but we're all out here because we all claim we want people to learn about history and remember history. Nothing made people remember history more than Band of Brothers and Save It Private Ryan. And so, I think it was a godsend that those things were put out because let's admit, if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have all these great productions that we've seen in the last 10, 15 years.
Don, as you went through that list of Iron Eagle and what came to my mind, Rambo.
Yeah.
I mean, like that, if that describes the 80s,
Oh yeah.
It's Rambo. I mean, it's just, he's fighting in Afghanistan. It's ridiculous. And I'm a big fan of Hollywood when they do their job right.
Well, let's not forget Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger and a young Alyssa Milano.
All that, they were even, there was years of Predator and all that stuff and Aliens, but there was just something about that era that nobody was wanting to get serious about life and the past and to study the past. I think you have to be a little serious and you have to be introspective and you have to say, why do I have the life I do? And what did that cost? You have to go deep. And when Hollywood does go deep for us, I think it's a good thing. That's why I'm a big fan of Devotion. I'm a big fan of trying to get these books made into movies, not because they're inadequate, but because Hollywood shows us it's the closest thing, aside from our own imagination when we read a story, it's the closest thing to what it might have looked like for those guys. And so kudos when they do it right. And I'm a big fan. We could talk war movies all night.
Well,
and it also reaches so many people that
yes,
because a lot of people aren't going to sit down like we will and read a book.
No, especially
but
kids.
they'll watch a movie.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the attention span is a little scary of people today. social media is not helping that. And so, yeah, I do worry about that at times as an author. Devotion as a movie, I'll say, it's a 2-hour movie and you get a good little lesson in the Korean War. And I think it's gonna speak to some 14-year-old kid who's never seen a Corsair before.
Yeah.
Never heard of the Chosin Reservoir. And so I think that movie is going to do its part. And so, yeah, even though it's easy sometimes to second guess Hollywood, I always said, why didn't they make Saving Private Ryan a true story? I'm sure they could have told the story of Bob Slaughter. I'm sure they could have told the story of Len Lamell. I mean, come on, tell Len Lamell's D-Day story. That's a Ranger story there. These are heroes that we've had the chance to know and cross paths with. So when Hollywood takes the chance to make a war movie, but they don't make it about a real story, that's when I think they're missing something, because, there's enough real heroes. Those of us who have studied this know that there's countless stories that are better than fiction, and they deserve to be told. So I'm just glad that we've got a movie coming out this November that's got the real names of the real guys in it. And that's always a risk when a movie makes, when they go and they actually cast real characters, they're taking a risk. And that's why Hollywood avoids it. It's so much easier to make wind talkers and to just make some amorphous Navajo code talkers and some grizzled old gunny sergeant and say, okay, there you go. Now you're learning about the code talkers. But, why didn't they make it Chester Nez? Why didn't they make it the real story of a real wind talker? So part of the reason is I think sometimes Hollywood thinks they're smarter than us. They can create something better than reality. Other times I think it's a risk thing. Gosh, are we going to catch hell from the families? Are we going to get this right? And it's easier just to say, okay, let's go make something fake. So when you do get a real war movie, it's almost really like once in a decade.
I was getting ready to say, enjoy it. I was getting ready to say you're giving them too much credit, but you just said it's easier to make. I was going to say you're giving them too much credit. It's easier just to hire someone to make something up out of whole cloth than it is to actually hire researchers and make sure it's accurate. So yes, it's more of a lazy thing. Let's make something up based off of what we heard and run with it. And you're in good company because we all feel the same way about wind talkers.
No, good.
When you're interviewing, veterans and people who were there, obviously they outline stories, missions, and they tell their tale and their memories and their ideas of it. For people who are listening who maybe want to get into researching, whether it's to improve their impression in living history, or maybe they themselves want to get into writing, whether it's for magazines, websites, or books, when you're in that situation where you're interviewing, gentlemen like you did with Charlie Brown and the German, what's your first step on, okay, I got their stories, I got the outline, but there's clearly obviously going to be gaps that you got to fill in, whether it's logistical stuff, dates, mission names, people who are involved, depending on the book. What is your first step, and where's your first place you go when trying to obtain the information needed to fill in those gaps to provide the history and to complete the story?
Well, I learned some of these things the hard way. And the first incident that comes to mind is when I went to interview a fighter pilot named Robin Olds. Robin Olds was a World War II fighter pilot. I don't think he flew in Korea. I can't remember. And then he flew in Vietnam, where I believe he was an ace, but I don't think he got credit for being an ace. He really shot down 5, but they didn't register it right. But I went to interview Robin Olds, and I still obviously don't know his story well enough. But Robin was, he just looked like a linebacker, even at age like 85. I mean, he was an imposing guy. And I went to Washington, D.C. because he was going to be doing a talk. And his World War II, his Mustang and his P-38 before that had a name of Scat. And I went up to him and he said, all right, let's talk. And this is after he does his speech. And I said, well, General Olds, let's talk about your aircraft, Scat the Third. What gave you the inspiration for that name? And he just kind of like got icy, and he just looked at me and he was like, if we're going to do a talk like this, do your homework first and don't ask me questions like that. You got to know where don't waste my time on stuff like that. It was something like that. And at the time I was like, wow, I don't like that guy. But, I come home and I grow up 10 years later, 20 years later, and then I run into Robin Olds again out at another event, and he's really cool. And I'm in a different place, and I learned from him that day. I learned that don't walk into this stuff blind. If you're gonna take somebody's hour of their life, know why they named their plane what they did. And the other story I've learned the hard way, I interviewed Len Lamel, I believe it was, at a Ranger reunion, and he was one of my heroes. And I always thought I'd have forever with these guys. I always thought, okay, well, I'll talk to Len here, and then I'll talk to him tomorrow, and then he lives in Toms River, New Jersey. I'll go see him there. And I spent the whole hour I had with him just starting with the questions about training and, growing up. He was an orphan growing up and in his background. And before you know it, somebody knocked on the door and they said, hey, Len, we need you down here. We're doing something at the reunion. And he had to go. And I never got that chance again. He went home, our paths never crossed, and we lost Len. And he was a dear friend, but I learned very quickly, you've got to cut to the chase. Everybody knows who's ever talked to a World War II veteran. If you start with, so tell me when you were born and what was it like growing up in the Great Depression, there's the end of your interview. You might as well just close your laptop, turn off your thing. You could almost just doze off because, the next hour is going to be spent with stories that are absolutely superfluous to what you need. You really want to get to, Len, what was it like when the Higgins boat pulls up and you've got fire ladders going up Point to Hawk and guys are shooting Lewis guns and you've got to climb up there with D Company? That's where I should have started the story. A lot of people make those mistakes, and I made them, and I learned the hard way. Luckily, I made them as a kid, so now I can do a little better as an adult. And the last lesson, I took from a lot of the research and writing, actually, I haven't taken this lesson yet, but I met Stephen Ambrose once. So it was kind of funny. We were hosting an event. I've never actually told this story, but we were hosting a Collins Foundation bomber fly-in, which was crazy because we were just kids at the time. We're 17 years old and we can barely drive. And we found out that the Collins Foundation respected the work we were doing, myself, my brother, my friend Joe. And they said, we'll come to your town. Here's what you got to do. You got to get us rental cars. You got to get us hotels. You got to get us media. And we said, okay, we can do all that. And we did. We got them all that, and they brought their bombers. So suddenly we're kids with a B-24, a B-17. And we also, I think, called somebody and got a B-25. So we're kids with warbirds on the tarmac of our local airport.
Wow.
And we got a call about a week before the event saying, Dr. Ambrose would like to come to your event. Turned out Stephen Ambrose was writing his book, The Wild Blue, and he wanted to fly on a B-24 to kind of complete his research. And of all the tour stops the Collins Foundation does in a year, let's say 120, he came to ours. And so he steps off this private jet, and we're like these kids, and Stephen Ambrose is there. Now, Band of Brothers is about, a year from coming out. It's filmed, and I got to hang out with him for a couple of days, and he took us aboard the bomber with him, and he gave us a chance. We were kids, but he gave us a chance. And I think anybody that's living history, they know that really well, that the kids are the future, and you've got to give them a chance. You've got to answer their stupid questions. You've got to encourage and nurture. And he did that for us. And so I can really say Stephen Ambrose was a mentor in the early days. And he told me once, he said, best piece of advice I can give you, marry an English teacher. He said, they will proofread all your work. They'll make you a better writer. They're great wives. He said, I did it. Marry an English teacher. So, I've taken some of his advice, not that one yet, but, he was a good man. And Band of Brothers was everything he set out to make it. And, thank God for Stephen Ambrose, because he really fueled what we do now.
Well, as someone who lives in your new area and who is married to a fourth grade teacher, I will happily tell you there are plenty of young teachers or single teachers around here that you could probably easily track you down an English teacher. When I first moved to this area, most of the women in the area were teachers because there wasn't a whole lot of work really outside of food service and all that. But this whole area has blown up in the last 20 years. But there's chances are you meet a young lady somewhere, chances are there probably will be a teacher. So that may come to fruition after all. But that's got to be 17, to have an idea, to figure out the connections and get all these planes in and get this thing off the ground, and then have someone like Stephen Ambrose come and not only want to show up to your event, but like you said, hang out with you, take you guys with him to do what he's doing. I'm sure a party's got to think, wow, we must be doing something right here. It had to be a great way to kind of make you realize that you weren't wasting your time and that you're clearly going down the right path.
Absolutely, Don. And he told me as we were walking around one day in the hangar, he said, there's an untold story here that you should be looking into. He said it's about the Tuskegee Airmen. And his book was about flying in the 15th Air Force, B-24s, George McGovern's plane. And so he was obviously, he was coming across that research about the 332nd Fighter Group. And so he was telling us we should be looking into it at that age. Sometimes it takes a little while for an idea to sink in. And it's like, 10 years, 15 years later, I wrote Devotion. But in a way, Jesse Brown was a version of the Tuskegee Airmen. He was the first black pilot in the U.S. Navy, and they inspired him, and he went on to inspire others. And so I got to write the book about somebody very similar all those years later. But absolutely, you need that stroke of luck sometimes. But it's funny, his son Hugh Ambrose, who worked on the Pacific, wrote the book The Pacific. He really carried the ball after his father died. He was with his dad during that trip, and we had dinner at my parents' house, and we're all sitting there around the table, and he said something similar. He said, "You guys are doing good work." And he said, there's a quote that always inspired me, and he said, "I want to pass it on to you." And I can't remember who said it, but it was Hugh Ambrose at the dinner table said, "The harder I work, the luckier I get." And it's kind of funny that short interaction, stays with you. The harder I work, the luckier I get. And yeah, it's true. A lot of life is not just magic happening. I think Hollywood sells us this idea that, life is easy. You just do the right thing and everything falls into place. No, if anything, being a writer has taught me that, so many people come to me and they say, "I want to write a book. Tell me how to write a book." Well, the biggest thing in writing a book, beyond having a good blueprint and understanding how to tell a good story, is finishing a book, is being persistent enough to do it. And so I think there's something to be said for persistence. You really never lose if you don't give up. And as a writer, you have to learn that every day. You have to repeat it every day, because you got to be persistent, and you can't give up tomorrow or the day after, even though a lot of this thing I do makes you want to pull your hair out. I mean, it's an exercise in frustration. So the harder I work, the luckier I get. It's a lesson for everything.
Adam, do you feel like the books that you've done, when you look back over each one, and you may have just addressed what I'm about to ask, but is there in every one of them where like the continuity just kind of, fall, like the treads just come off the tank, and you just have to get things back on track and get remotivated? Has that, I guess every writer struggles with that no matter what they're doing. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And some people call it writer's block, Henry, but I think there's a very easy answer for it. And that is, you get writer's block when you don't have adequate information. So if you have enough good quotes, and if you've been to the place, if you walk the grounds, if you know what you're writing about, you don't really hit writer's block. Writer's block comes when you're unprepared. And so that's the one thing I would say to anybody who's trying to write and they're getting stumped. That's when you've got to stop, and you've got to go back to either your research materials. You're hitting writer's block not because your brain is failing you. It's because you lack information to finish the task you've started. You got to go get that information. So does that kind of answer what you were asking?
It does, because every book is not going to just be this smooth flow, this linear process. There are going to be hiccups and stumbles. So yeah.
And I want to back up to something you said a few minutes ago, which I think is very important, which is the harder you work, the luckier you become. And kind of the writer's block too, which I think can relate to all sort of content creators, if you will, to use modern day terms. I started this podcast back in 2018. It was just me in a room talking about living history and then interviewing people, and being lucky enough to every once in a while come across a veteran to interview. And as the more I worked on this little podcast, the more connections I made, as we were talking about before the show, through Instagram post and a production being done called Walking Point. I met Jeff. Continue to do some work, interview Jeff in the production company at the movie set, and then communicate with Jeff. Next thing I know, I'm going out to Texas. Never thought my little podcast would end me up in Texas. He and I got to be friends. Hey, be my co-host. You know about stuff I don't know about. You give me someone to talk to consistently. So he and I worked this little podcast, made more connections. Then, a year or so later, Henry came our way. None of this stuff would have happened if I would have done 10 podcasts, said, well, that's it. It's too hard, or I've ran out of ideas. Sometimes I wouldn't do an episode for a week or two until I went to a living history event or watched something on TV that sparked inspiration, and then I would go research it. And yeah, it's just the more you work at it, the more connections you make, and the more things fall in line, and things just grow on their own. It's kind of like you hear comedians talk about finding their voice. Well, kind of same thing for whether you're an author, a songwriter, a podcast creator, or a YouTube creator. It's after you do something long enough, it kind of naturally finds its own voice, and it leads you into different directions. And so you have to be willing to put in the work, even if at the beginning or a few years into it, there's really no payout other than the joy that you get knowing that there's people out there who enjoy your work.
Absolutely, Don. I think back to the times when we had this little homemade magazine of ours, and first couple issues we had 5 subscribers, 10. We were publishing for nobody. We would go to air shows that first summer, and we had just enough money to get there. And then where do you sleep? You sleep under the wing of a B-17. I remember they used to up in Elmira was the National Warplane Museum, and they had the B-17 Fuddy Duddy at the time. And we would sleep under the wing of that plane because they let us.
Yeah.
They'd say, get out of there by 8 o'clock in the morning. We're going to run up the engines. But, it's fun now to, sign some books, go to events and do all this stuff, post photos of yourself on Instagram like you're cool. But the reality is I started just sleeping under the wing of a B-17 because we couldn't afford hotel rooms. We would sell our little magazines from a card table. I mean, we're talking 4 folding legs, no umbrella, and you'd stand out in the sun at the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum from 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 at night, selling to sometimes World War II buffs, sometimes kids, sometimes grandfathers. Sometimes you would even get these rich guys that would come up to you, and they were usually warbird owners, and they would fit a profile. They would have the glasses, they'd have the boat shoes, little short shorts, little white shorts, and the polo shirt
tucked in.
And they just, I wish I could say nice things about them, but they would come up and they'd hold a magazine, they'd leaf through it, and we'd say, have you heard of our magazine? It's $2. And they'd put it down. They'd say, hey, good luck, kids. You're doing a good thing. And they'd walk away. And now I realize what total, they were. At the time, I think we knew too. I think we probably didn't like them either. But the point is, you got to get kicked in the teeth a lot. And that was a kick in the teeth. I mean, we used to tell people it's less than a hot dog. That was our sales thing. Buy our magazine. It's about veteran stories. It's cheaper than a hot dog here. And it was. And, and I look back and it's like, that's what we had to try to do to make it. That's how those are the growing pains. And we got kicked in the teeth, and we had to do it a lot. And we had to sleep under a lot of planes. And we did that for summer after summer after summer after summer. And we didn't realize that we were actually training ourselves to write and also to persevere.
Yep.
Both of those things. And so, I've heard some people, there's other authors that when I've written a book, they've said, oh yeah, that young rich kid came in and stole the story I was going to do. And I was going to write a book about that. And he got to him first, and his daddy did. Like, no, there's no dad in the picture that's funding this. There's no easy road. Just aggressiveness, perseverance, and a belief that anything's possible.
Isn't it funny how when somebody has a desire to do something, but not the motivation or the motor, and then they come across someone else who's doing it and more successful, instead of acknowledging the drive and the rough and tumbleness of the person who did it. They try to find an excuse to make them feel better why they haven't done it yet the other person has. It's so frustrating, and it seems to be more and more of a common occurrence now than it ever has been before.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're saying you're sitting out in the heat. Don't sell yourself short. Jeff can attest to this. He's around runways. You had not only the heat from coming from above, but you had reflective heat coming off that damn tarmac. That's one of the things I hate about air shows. It's so damn hot from the tarmac. That reflective heat so you get it from the top and the bottom, and you probably left so many shows just looking like a lobster, just completely sunburnt because you couldn't even afford the table to put the umbrella to put over your table.
Oh, then Don, we thought we were getting smart. We went to a show in Frederick, Maryland. It was a CAF show, and we thought we were smart. We were going to sleep in the car.
Oh boy.
You know, oh gosh, you know, it just went from bad to worse. It's like, okay, I'll go back to sleeping on the ground that gets all moist and dewy, you know, in the morning. I'll just take that over sleeping in the car. So yeah, you learn the hard way, but you know, we paid our dues, and that's what's so important, I think, to doing anything well. What you guys are doing, you're doing it well because you've lived this, and you've invested your time, and you've paid your dues. I've seen other people come in and try to write World War II books, and they're coming off of writing, you know, self-help books or other stuff like that, and they just kind of try to step into this world and try to be a World War II author. You know, it doesn't work. You can't do it. You have to put in the time, and everybody here's put in the time. And World War II is the kind of thing you don't just pick it up overnight.
No.
But you got to start somewhere.
You got to have the inherent love for the subject.
Exactly.
How do you go about when you're thinking about a new project or a new book or what have you? How do you make sure that you're not plowing the same old row? I mean, because World War II obviously has been around 80 years. There's been so many books, so many movies, so many topics, and Jeff and I and Henry too. We often talk that we enjoy trying to cover topics on this podcast that you haven't seen covered in so many amounts of times on every history or military channel show. So I assume that when you're thinking about a project, do you take that in consideration? I want to cover something that hasn't been done 30,000 times. Or is it strictly, hey, this is what I have a passion for right now, so I'm going for it regardless?
You know, Don, it's kind of funny because I kind of feel like there's sometimes a little bit of a divine intervention in the projects I've chosen. It's just gone from one to another in a magical kind of way. And there have been stories that I've tried to chase that have blown up in my face. One of them was I really wanted to do a book about the first Special Service Force, the forcemen that were half, American lumberjacks and ski instructors and outdoorsmen. The other half were Canadian outdoorsmen, and they were put together in this mixed nationality unit and trained up in Montana. And the force was just awesome. So I go up to a reunion in Helena, Montana, where the old forcemen are gathering. And I'm just like, this is my next book. This is my next book. I'm going to do this. And it didn't work. All the guys that I needed to talk to were gone. And I couldn't get the pieces to fall into place. There weren't Americans left who had fought at this battle on Monte Defensa, where they snuck up at night and they crawled up by the ropes and they ambushed the Germans in the pre-dawn hours on the top of an Italian mountain. I wanted to tell that story. There were no Americans left, no American heroes. And I really wanted to have an American basis to this book. There were a few Canadians left, but the pieces just weren't there. And so I had to kind of step aside from that story and look for something else. So I think it comes to another sort of lesson I've learned, and that is you walk through the doors that open to you. There were times in my early life where I'd try to beat down a door, whatever it took. And then you start to see that, something's not working out. Maybe it's because it's not meant to be. And the older you get, you feel that. And so I started walking through the doors that were open. And stories do that, I believe. If you have the right intention and you're pursuing the right thing, you're going to find your path. And for me, I've somehow stumbled from good book to good book to good book. But I think ultimately you have to say to yourself, what makes these stories different? I think it's I like a story that's got humanity in it and not necessarily the thing we've seen in all those other war movies we were talking about. For so long, heroism was based upon
Kill
the
count.
killing, how many people you killed and how close you were to a real life Rambo. And I think where I've been successful is that I've kind of erred on the side of what's the human story, and is this guy is a good guy? Is he a worthy hero? So somebody like Clarence Schmoyer in Spearhead, I mean, just such a humble guy. And at first I didn't know if there was a story there, but I sat down with him, I started pulling stuff out of him, and I found out this guy was a legend, and he didn't know it. So I think finding those humans that you believe in first. There are pilots like that are just good guys, Bud Anderson types, that just they're worth it. And when you're investing in good people and you have good intentions, for some reason those doors kind of open to you. And when they're not opening, well, that's a signal. Try something else.
Jeff, you have any follow-up questions?
Yeah, I appreciate two of the things that you've covered. One, talking about sleeping under the wing of a B-17, and it kind of reminds me of a saying. I don't know where I came across it, but you're doing something right when people choose to do something that you didn't have a choice in doing. And I think that's sometimes a lot of time a mark of success, from, a prior service member, to see guys, get a kick out of sleeping in a foxhole at night. Like, but that's when you knew you were doing something, because people are paying or going out of their way to volunteer to do it. Who wouldn't pay now today to camp out under the wing of a B-17? You did it because you had to. And obviously I think that's a testament to the devotion, pun intended, that you had in your mission. And I think you're absolutely right too. And Don mentioned as well, I think I'm probably the luckiest guy I know, and I'd like to think that I'm a pretty hardworking guy too, and things don't just come your way. These two guys know anytime I get a new shipment of books in or some new artifact, whatever, they're the first ones to know about it. I'm kind of like rubbing it in their face, but at the same time, it's
successfully you are. I'm just like, man, send some of this stuff my way. And I know Don's saying the same thing,
Yeah, I even put out a plug to get people to mail books to me, thinking they're mailing them to him, but it didn't work.
But I think a lot of it's because I live in a small town, and a lot of people around here know my passion for World War II. If you say World War II in a 100-mile radius, they're going to say, talk to Jeff Copsetta, right? I mean, that's just kind of how it is around here. And to have the opportunities, like yourself, to kind of be able to expand that. Don mentioned The Walking Point. That was one film that I was involved in. It was a lot of fun, and I hope there's more that come down the road to help, kind of leave a mark, like you have, like you've left the mark on World War II. My mark has been really more from a personal standpoint. I have a hard time. I'm not very good at sharing some of the experiences that I've been through. I'm not very good at recording, but I wish I was. I recall being, I want to say I was 12 at Mid-Atlantic Air Show, because we knew Robert Morgan was going to be there. And we kind of carpooled. My grandfather was driving his 36 British Railton, that was owned by an advisor to Churchill during the war. And my dad was driving another one of my grandfather's cars. I don't remember the year, but it was an old Auburn. And I'm riding with my dad in this Auburn from New Jersey to the Mid-Atlantic Air Show, in a car that was at that time still 60-some years old. It barely had brakes, and he's trying to run through the gears in this old boat-tailed Auburn, trying to get to the air show. And I have pictures and I have memories, and I remember going to school, middle school age, same thing, talking about how I got to meet Robert Morgan, my childhood hero. And like you, who cares? Next, they wanted to talk about Emmett Smith, not Robert Morgan at the time, so I can absolutely relate with you. And like I said, just from somebody who shares a lot of those same passions and is kind of, has a lot of those similar interests, I applaud you, because to be able to elevate your passion, to have dedicated what you've done, to have worked as hard as you are to do what you're doing now, it really is a calling. And just this morning, one of my students came up to me and said, Mr. Cobb said, why are you always about World War II? What is it about World War II? And I if I had time to prepare an intelligent answer, I probably would have. but I just don't. I think World War II kind of chose me, and I feel like that at times. And I'm pretty sure you probably feel the same way. I think it is a calling to answer, maybe even a higher call that we answer sometimes. There I go again. But the last thing I wanted to leave you with, I literally, you can see this is just a portion of the books. It's all about the Second World War. These guys know that I'm a huge reader. I have Spearhead next to me only because Higher Call was so good that I sent that book to a relative of mine, to my uncle who's still back in New Jersey. I don't like to let go of books. I don't let people borrow my books.
Ain't that the truth?
But it was that good that, he's an aviation nut. He was there as his son, my cousin, we grew up together, same age, going to air shows. And, as these guys are getting older, it was my uncle's birthday. I said, you know what, I'm going to send him the best book I think I've ever read on the Second World War. And I mailed him my copy. So I hope that at least gives you some idea of the appreciation I had for that book, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler, to be able to be introduced to that. And, I can't say enough. This has been, I feel complete. If we don't have another guest on What's the Scuttlebutt, I feel complete. I've talked to everybody now. I think that I'd really love to have a conversation with, and to be able to express my appreciation to you, at least somewhat face to face, man. It's just awesome. It's incredible.
Well, Jeff, I appreciate it very much. And you're right. World War II chose us. And so I always look at this as, we're all kind of guys batting on the same team. We all believe in the same thing. We all love the same thing, and we're kindred spirits in a lot of ways. And so that's why when you write these books, you're sharing a story with family, and that family passes on the story, and it doesn't feel like I did anything for you or you did anything for me. We're doing it for the reason we're supposed to do it. And it's just, it's something so much bigger than us. Yeah, I really appreciate what you said. And at the same time, I just feel like I'm just a guy who's lucky enough to have the luxury of sitting down and spending 8 hours a day doing the same thing for 365 days in a row. And everybody's giving back in a different way. I just have mine, and, it's a little antisocial, and it's why I haven't met an English teacher yet. But, everybody in this chat has their own way of giving back, and I'm just one small part of it.
I think there's something to be said about having the ability to hang out with people who have the shared passion, whether it's, fishing, golfing, or what have you. And there's been times where I've gone to living history events where, sadly, that particular year, for whatever reason, maybe the crowd wasn't as big as we wanted. But the guys who were there for the weekend, setting up their impressions and their displays, the public. But even if the public isn't, the turnout's not as great as we want for that event, just being there for the weekend around guys who share the same interest, not being around computers and cell phones, talking to public, doing our displays, and then sitting around a campfire all night, just shooting the shit and relaying the same information for 24, 48 hours. When you leave there, the older you get, your body's sore from sleeping on the ground all weekend, what have you. But you come away from it refreshed and renewed and almost reinvigorated for the hobby, because there's some times where it'll be a few months where between events, especially down here in Florida, because we don't do a lot of them in the summertime because, well, heat and wool don't go well together. And then, like I said, I just fresh off of a event we just did up in Paris, Florida over the weekend at the Florida Train Museum we do every year. And it just reignites that fire after, I got up there Friday night, came home yesterday, and something about being around people who share the same interests with that you do. It just really, it helps the human spirit almost. I can't explain it. It's just something about it.
I agree. And, Don, there's a converse side to it. And that is sometimes living in a country, in a world where more people than not don't care, frustrating as hell. And it makes your daily life a little bit difficult at times, because it's almost like we all have encountered this, we've unlocked and encountered this secret knowledge. It's like a knowledge of, how good humanity can be, how bad humanity can be, and kind of this playbook for life. And there's other people that just go about their lives with the blinders on. and all they care about is the dumbest crap. And it's so frustrating because the stuff that matters, we know the stuff that matters. That's what we've discovered. We've discovered the most important thing in life, and that is that some people have made huge sacrifices for the good of others. And that's our fixation. That's what fuels us and invigorates us. And there's other people that think the greatest thing in life is to go to an EDM concert and to stand packed together and wave glow sticks and bounce up and down like a toddler.
Sure.
And so, I think there's just those two polar opposites of people. There's old souls who seem to get it, and there's these young souls who are so naive, and they kind of are driving our society off a cliff. And so it's really, I think that's why this family that we're talking about is so important and so invigorating, because those are the people that get it, and we're kind of fighting against a world that sadly most don't. So,
well, there's also a third group that's even worse, and that is the ever-growing group of people who try to find something evil in something that's not there. Perfect example. I don't want to get too deep into it, but the event we did this last weekend, we do every year. The synopsis is this: the public buys train tickets. They pull into the Florida Train Museum, and there's Germans walking around. Big old swastika flag on the building. They hand out German passports. The whole thing is you're in German-occupied France, so the civilians who paid right on the train, they are now French civilians being shipped off to a German work camp. And as the train goes down the line, it stops. We have a skirmish. By the end of the day, the Americans liberate the train. You get a little history. There's some worked-out speeches involved, and everybody has a good time. Just this last weekend, we're down doing a skirmish on the train. A few of the Germans stayed back. Someone pulled off the street. Now, keep in mind, this event has gone on in this town every year for 20 years. The town is growing. Someone came off the street because they saw the swastika flag and were raising holy. What the hell is going on here? Blah, 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 blah. The German reenactors explained this is a living history event. We're teaching about the people of history of World War II, the evils that came along with it. And this woman was just taking pictures, and the only reason she did it was so that she could go online and try to turn it into something that it wasn't. And there's so many people have an interest in doing that now. I often say everybody's their own newspaper editor, and they're just looking for content. And sadly, everybody wants the evil content because that's what gets clicks. Everybody wants to turn something into something that it's not. And it's just so damn frustrating, especially when it comes to history.
I've been lucky. I've been spared a lot of that, Don. I've just been very fortunate. I've had the good fortune of interacting with good people, and people have been generally respectful. And so, knock on wood, I've been able to avoid most of those people. But they're out there. You're right. That's third class.
Before we wrap it up, Henry, you got any closing thoughts or questions?
No, it's just been a great pleasure to have Adam in here, and I was trying to let Jeff take as much time as he wanted to because I know how bad he's wanted to.
Fanboy, I get it.
Well, I'm a fanboy too. I mean, but no, Adam. I mean, it's just been so great to reconnect with you, and like I said, man, a lot of more things I want to talk to you about, but I'm really. I have fond memories back when you were coming to visit us a lot in 2009 and early 2010. There's Andrea still talks about that picture of you in the kitchen with Jack on your shoulders.
Jack's
he called
too
you
big to
Uncle
do that
Adam.
now.
Yeah, he's probably about your height now.
My God, yeah, we had a lot of fun, and I've always regretted that I've worked on different chapters. So I was in the Sid Phillips, Eugene Sledge chapter, and I spent 2 years, and I saw you a lot and came down to Mobile. And then I shifted gears, and that was when the Higher Call began, and started working on that. And then I had to shift and say goodbye to Charlie and Franz and move on to Devotion and so on and so forth. And so it's been these short chapters, but man, it lasts forever. And it's, seeing the books on your desks and hearing that it impacted you, it was all worth it. And the friendships you make, that's why we do it. And I've held that knife and that K-bar in the background there, and things like that. I'm the lucky one. I mean, I got to spend some good quality time with you.
Well, and like these guys know, as I circled back around a little over a year ago to get back into the World War II community, man, I sat down and reconnected with the Pacific, and we don't have to get into it now, but I know you and I had some conversations about it, but I had a real change of heart on it.
It gets better with time, doesn't it?
It definitely does. Totally does.
It's interesting because I was at that event this weekend, and there were some new young kids who joined up that I hadn't met. And I was just listening to them talk, and one of them had just got introduced to the Pacific, and I didn't join in. I was just listening to his thoughts and ideas, and he was right in the same camp. It was like, I liked Band of Brothers, but there's just something about the Pacific and what it got into. He said it was just such a great show, and so to see this coming out of the mouth of a 17-year-old, it's like great. There's still some young ones coming our way. So yep, we had a few new recruits this weekend, and it's just fun hearing them discover the things that we've all been watching or reading for years. And so good news is there's young ones out there. We just got to get more of them.
That's very good news, Don.
Before we wrap it up, you want to put out your plugs where people can find you, order your books, etc.?
Oh man, I got to keep the lights on. You would always think that an author after a few hits would get to retire to an island, but no. You could actually, by the end of the day, you could probably make more money working at a Taco Bell as a manager than you do writing these books, because you divide up how long it takes.
Yeah.
Spearhead, I worked on that over the course of 7 years. A higher call was more than that, and you put decades into this stuff. Valor Studios is my go-to these days. We've always we've made these really cool historical products, and so when our little magazine was taking off, one day we discovered that if we sold one piece of artwork from World War II, it was equivalent of selling a whole box of magazines. So we started doing that side by side just to pay the bills, and it grew into an art business by itself and collectibles. And Henry and I made a couple paintings together about the Pacific, and so it's all storytelling. It's just storytelling in a different means. And in this case, you sell a print somebody that can hang on their wall. I'd say go to Valor Studios. Check out our artwork. We've got some incredible stuff. And as far as the books go, all my books there are signed by the heroes. And it's like, it blows my mind now that we've lost Clarence Schmoyer that, he signed this, and he was my friend. And now you can buy that book and you can collect it and you can pass it on to one of your grandkids. And man, these things are treasures. Mm-hmm. And I'm proud of them. I'm proud to have known these men. I'm proud that their autographs will live on forever. And I'm proud that you can go and buy them and make use of them, because that's why we do it. If you really want to make money, you don't sell collectibles. You don't do that. You don't work at a museum. You don't write books. You go work on Wall Street. You just make money. I'm not in it for that. I'm in it to tell a story. And so, anybody who wants to check out a higher call, devotion, all that stuff, it's on our website. And go see the Devotion movie November 23rd, because there's a lot of real World War II airplanes that are in Korean War markings, and they're flying around. And you've never seen Corsairs on the big screen like this. So, that's my last thing, Don. Go see Devotion. It's going to be good.
And as always, you can head over to WTSBWorldWar2.com, click on the link and that represents this episode, and we will have any pertinent links so you can find them. That way, if you're driving in your car or wherever and you didn't have the opportunity to write those addresses down, they can all be found at WTSPWorldWar2.com. Now, before we wrap up the show, I want to say this for the end because, well, it's sad news. About 3 hours ago, I got word that a friend of mine and a co-worker that worked on a radio station with me, Mr. Chris Quinton, who was a sergeant in the United States Army, passed away on Friday. He was, we often refer to our fans as the OG5, and that refers to all the podcasts here on the Digital 410 Network. And Chris was like literally number 2. He's been listening to our podcast since he and I worked in radio together. He was in promotions, driving vans, handing out T-shirts. And when we would do the What's in Your Head podcast, he was always in the live chats. And so just want to say, to the memory of Chris Quinton, thank you, buddy, for always being around and listening to the shows and supporting us, and prayers for you and your family. And on that note, I think we will talk to you all next week. We want to continue to thank everybody for supporting the show. We love you all, and we'll talk to you all next week.
Digital 410 Productions.
This has been a Digital 410 production.